Hey guys, welcome back to another video on the channel. We're doing a series of miniature games from the European National Team Championship, which was played a few days ago in Batumi, Georgia. This is the second game of the series, and today's game featuring FIDE master Gustavo Ribeiro from Portugal playing with the white pieces, and Avital Boruchovsky, a grandmaster from Israel, with the black pieces. As I said, in today's game we will be taking a deep dive into the problems you might face if you delay your piece development. So this is a very important game for those of you who want to understand better the importance of developing your pieces and the dangers you face if you delay the development. So here you'll see the banner of the team event, European Team Championship 2025. As I said, played in Batumi from the 4th to the 15th of October, and you can just see the strength and the depth of the players participating. I recognize there Kaimer, Mamedyarov, Giri. I think that's Fedosiev and Rapport up the top, and below I can recognize Kosteniuk, Stavrula, Zagnitze. I think that's Julia Osmak, and finally I think that's Nino Batsiasvili. So a very strong event with many top players participating. Let's go to the game. Here we go. And as I said, please pay attention and try to focus on the development issues in this game. I think that's the most important. Of course, Avital playing with the black pieces. He is a grandmaster rated over 2500, so a very strong player. But Ribeiro is quite a strong FIDE master from Portugal, pushing for the IM title. FIDE master is 2300 level. He's slightly dropped underneath 2245 now, but he's quite strong. And I do think he played quite well in this game. And of course, he is a very strong player. He understands perfectly the need to develop. But as in all things, when good players make mistakes, we, and I include myself, we always think that we'll have enough time to finish, although we understand the dangers, and then it's just, it all depends on the strength and the performance of our opponent. So let's get going. White started with e4, c5, Avital goes for the Sicilian, knight f3, d6, and Ribeiro opts for the bishop b5 check, the Moscow line, very fashionable, alongside the Rossolimo, just to try and sidestep theory. Of course, there are several ways to block here. Avital goes for knight to c6, which is perfectly decent. Castle, bishop to d7. For those of you who are interested in understanding better theory and trying to reduce the amount of theory you need to learn, if you play knight to c6 against bishop to b5 check, that also allows you to play d6 if you play against the Rossolimo. So you can, I think it's kill two birds with one stone. At least I think that's the way of saying it in English. So it's useful to have lines which you can play against two different variations. Whereas if you go for bishop to d7 or knight to d7, which are the other two main alternatives, these are two moves you won't be able to do against the Rossolimo. So knight to c6, of course white can exchange on c6 if they want, but Ribeiro goes for castle, which is the main move. Bishop to d7, rook to e1, and now Avital goes for a6. Now you might wonder if black is playing correctly by playing on the queen side and neglecting his development on the king side. It might be risky, and the way to punish this sort of play is to try and open up the position and get ahead on the attack. So for example, a topical line here, which I actually play with white, is bishop takes knight, and either d4 straight away, which is quite interesting, or c3 and now d4. I've played this pawn sacrifice a lot, and I think it's actually very interesting, a very interesting pawn sacrifice. Because as you can see, white is ahead in development. Of course, with perfect play, black should equalize, but number one, he has to know the theory, and number two, he has to remember it, which is not the same thing, and understand it. Of course, Avital understands this, and what he's trying to think is, he wants to get the bishop pair and finalize his development afterwards. But he is taking a risk. In any case, Ribeiro played bishop to f1, which is a theoretical move, trying to occupy the center anyway, but without giving up the two bishops. Perfectly reasonable, and as you can see by the times, both players playing very fast, so both of them are in theory. e5, occupying the center, preventing d4, c3, and bishop to e7. Perfectly correct, perfectly safe. Okay, now here Ribeiro very quickly plays d4, which is correct. However, I did notice that the engines were also suggesting that maybe h3 could be an option. And after knight to f6, only now d4. And it's a game, it's a game. I think black is okay, but I'd still take white very slightly over black in this position. I mention h3 because after d4, Avital found a very cool idea. He captured with the pawn, and now he pinned the knight on f3 with the bishop, adding extra strength to the attack on d4. He did this very fast as well, so he's actually putting pressure on the clock as well, not only on the board. Now, of course, here white has several options to protect this pawn. I think that the best option is to go d5. Knight to d4, and now to follow up with bishop to e3. Of course, we will allow our king side to be damaged, but then again, I think that maybe after knight to c3 or knight to d2, maybe it's not so bad for white, because we do have the bishop pair. We still have the bishop pair. The king can hide on h1. I can't see it so easy for black to attack on the king side. This must be more or less okay. However, Ribeiro didn't see it this way, or didn't want his king side to be damaged, and opted for d takes e5. And as you can see, he did take a couple of minutes to take this decision. D takes e5. And of course now he could have exchanged queens, which would have been a sensible way to, even though he might slightly be behind on pawn structure, he does simplify the position, and it's unlikely you'll lose a game just because you have a double pawn on the king side. But Ribeiro wanted to fight, and he played knight b to d2, which I think is okay, but already he's delaying his queenside development. Knight to f6 and h3. Of course, if Avital swapped on f3 now, that would be fantastic for white. He'd get a decent position now. He could possibly even capture with the queen. But Avital keeps the pin on, which is very good. In this position, I checked with the engine, because although the position is equal, I wanted to know if white would be forced to play g4 here to unpin the knight. A risky move, something that I'm sure Ribeiro didn't want to do, as we saw before when he is not allowing his pawns to be doubled. So it seems to me that Ribeiro is one of those players that prefer, as myself, to have their king safety. But if that's the case, black can exploit that if he notices when he prepares the game. So g4 would actually be okay in this position. Bishop to b3, and now maybe knight to c4. And there is enough pressure on the center, and if the queens disappear, the kingside weakness isn't so dangerous. However, Ribeiro didn't understand it that way. He opted for queen to b3, another way of unpinning and pressing on b7. But as you can see, still delaying his queenside. Castle. Knight to c4. Of course, queen takes pawn would have been an option, but after queen a5, the queen has no square to retreat. So every time you see an attack on b7, notice if the pawn is on a6, and if the pawn is on a6, you can most likely capture the queen with knight to a5, because the queen doesn't have the retreat queen to a6, so something to be wary of. Castle, knight to c4. The queen is protecting the knight on f3, but now, after the exchange, black plays b5, knight to e3, and knight to d4. And now black has taken over the initiative. He's attacking the queen. e4 is under attack. The bishop on c1 is not developed yet. Now black is under control and white is in trouble. He's under pressure. Queen to g3, with the idea that after knight takes e4 to recapture on e5. True, the knight has lost its protection, but although the knights are attacked, black has a very fine move here, which is rook to e8. I am thinking that maybe Ribeiro missed this rook to e8 when he went into this line. Of course, this is just a speculation on my part. What is the idea? That if white captures the knight, we get in bishop to b4 with a double attack, and black picks up material. So if the knight can't be captured, we are threatening bishop to f6 or bishop to b4, and now white is in trouble. In fact, he spent here 35 minutes trying to find a solution to all of the threats that black has. He finally found knight to f5, which is the best move, but it doesn't solve his problems. Of course, there is a threat of checkmate, so bishop to f6 was played, queen to f4, and at least black hasn't lost material. But now black finds queen to d5, fantastic move, communicating the rooks, protecting the knight on e4, which was under attack, and now he's threatening knight to c2, along with some other very nasty tricks, which we'll see very soon. Now, black is playing this position admirably, he's playing very well, and white, having missed this move, presumably rook to e8, is under big trouble. Knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, very strong move. Again, alarming lack of development, and here the only move for white would have been bishop to e3, sacrificing the pawn on b2 and also sacrificing the pawn on a2. Now, would white have survived this position? 2 pawns down? Unlikely. But he does have some things going for him. The knight is slightly unprotected on e4. The queen and bishop are out of play. White does have the 2 bishops, maybe a small initiative. The computer more or less assesses this as 1.5 for white, for black, so black is clearly better, but there is still a game. Instead of this, Ribeiro played rook to e2, protecting both b2 and f2 and threatening bishop to e3, but the uncoordinated pieces are very clear here, whereas black has 100% coordination, and in these situations normally there's a tactical trick and black goes for it. Knight takes f2, fantastic, and after rook takes f2, black gets in rook to e1, and there's a permanent threat here. The bishop remains pinned and the other rook is coming in to finish off the job, and this is completely lost. A sample variation would be, for example, king to h2 would automatically lose to bishop to e5 with a pin, whereas king to h1 would lose very quickly to rook takes, queen takes, rook a e8, and white is completely blocked here on the first rank. If white goes b3 to try and get bishop to b2, then the rook comes in, and there's actually a very cool checkmate in this position with queen takes g2. So this would be a clear idea of what can happen to you if you get caught up in this position. So eventually after thinking a bit, white played bishop to e3, which he'd obviously calculated before. He probably thought, I'll give up the f2 pawn, exchange the bishops, maybe the knight will be trapped, I might still be in the game. And Avital came down with the hammer, rook takes e3, and now a fantastic finish, knight d1, which I'm assuming, again, Ribeiro missed knight to d1 when he played rook to e2, because if he'd seen knight to d1 here, he wouldn't have played rook e2 for sure. He's a very strong player, he would have understood this. But chess is difficult, especially at the highest levels. Stress does play a role, and he probably miscalculated, didn't see knight to d1 in his head. Of course, the rook is dropping, and if rook takes knight, we go bishop to e3, check, queen to e3, and this is a technical ending, which obviously Ribeiro did not want to face against a grandmaster as strong as Avital. Unbelievable 99.2% accuracy for Avital in this game. It wasn't hugely complex, so you do expect a very high accuracy score, but even so 99% is quite impressive for the Israel grandmaster. And these are the dangers of lacking your development and not finding a way out of a difficult position. And of course, the huge merit to the opponent for taking advantage. I do hope you enjoyed the game. Leave me a comment below. Subscribe if you aren't a subscriber, and come back here every 2 or 3 days for new games, new miniature games, highlighting different opening ideas, interesting tactics, and also getting a chance to meet and be acquainted to new and exciting players. From me, that's enough for today. See you in a couple of days. Improve, learn, have fun while you're playing, and see you in the next video. Cheers.